Famines have redrawn maps and toppled empires more silently than any army. By the end of this video, you will understand how food shortages shaped the rise and fall of civilizations across thousands of years. What made a simple crop failure bring down the mighty Bronze Age kingdoms? How did a cold winter in Sweden lead to the end of an empire? Food is power, and when it vanishes, nothing stays the same. This journey explores 30 pivotal periods of severe food shortage that directly altered the course of empires, from ancient collapses to modern shifts. The first of these dates back to the Bronze Age. What comes to mind when you think of civilizations that vanished? Around 1200 before the Common Era, the great empires of the Late Bronze Age began to crumble. It was not a single invasion that brought them down, but a silent and relentless enemy, a prolonged drought that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. For years, the rains failed, crops withered in the fields, the palace economies of the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and even the mighty Egyptian New Kingdom depended on centralized grain storage and redistribution. When the harvests disappeared, the entire system collapsed. Without food, the palaces could not pay their workers, maintain their armies, or keep order. In many cities, written records simply stop. The Hittite capital was abandoned, Mycenaean palaces burned. Egypt managed to survive but lost its empire. Historians have long debated the role of the so-called Sea Peoples in these events. Research now suggests that these migrating groups were not a mysterious invading force, but rather displaced populations fleeing the same hunger. Their movements triggered chain reactions of conflict and upheaval across the region. This famine did not just weaken a few kingdoms, it erased the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, plunging the region into a dark age that lasted for centuries. And it set the stage for new powers to rise from the ashes. A few centuries later, another crisis struck, this time under cold, gray skies. In the spring of 1315, the rains began over northern Europe, and they did not stop. Month after month, the skies poured down, turning fields into mud, rotting seeds before they could sprout. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was not a single year of hardship, but a relentless cycle of failed harvest. Grain prices soared beyond what common people could afford. The region had relied on a delicate balance of weather and soil, and when that balance broke, the entire system of feudal obligation began to crack. Lords could not collect rents because tenants had nothing to give. Peasants abandoned their lands in search of any food, only to find that the scarcity was everywhere. Even the nobility struggled, and chronicles from the time describe how ordinary families were forced to eat tree bark, roots, and even the soil itself to survive. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another and influenced early approaches to well-being. This famine did not just empty stomachs. It emptied villages. It broke the old bonds that tied serfs to the land. When the rains finally relented, the social order had shifted. The population was smaller, but the survivors were less willing to accept their former roles. Within a few decades, the Black Death would deliver an even heavier blow, but the Great Famine had already planted the seeds of change. Peasant uprisings grew more common. The feudal system, already strained, began its long decline, and in that collapse, new opportunities for freedom and mobility emerged, setting the stage for the late medieval world. To the east of those medieval fields, another kingdom rose and faced its own test of cold and hunger. Sweden in the late 1600s was a major European power, controlling much of the Baltic region. Its king, Charles XI, had built a strong army and a stable treasury, but no fortress could keep out the weather. In the winter of 1695, temperatures plunged and stayed low. The Baltic Sea froze solid, and ice covered the ground for months past the usual spring thaw. When farmers finally planted their seeds, the cold had not loosened its grip. The crops that did push through were stunted and sparse. The following year brought no relief. Snow fell in summer and frost killed the harvest before it could ripen. Across the Swedish heartland, grain stores ran dry, prices skyrocketed, and the poorest families had nothing left to trade. Historians note that in some provinces, nearly a tenth of the population passed away from hunger and the illnesses that follow it. The health challenges of the era forced communities to share what little they had, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed local charity. Charles XI faced a painful choice. His empire depended on a strong military to hold its conquests, but without grain, he could not feed the soldiers, let alone pay them. He ordered a sharp reduction in the army, shrinking the very force that had made Sweden a great power. The king also emptied his own treasury to buy food from abroad, but the funds did not go far. The famine deepened discontent among the common people, who saw their suffering as a sign that the crown had failed them. When Charles XI died in 1697, just as the famine finally eased, he left behind a kingdom weakened and its people restless. His young son, Charles XII, would soon inherit not only the throne but also the anger and the instability. Within a few years, a coalition of enemies attacked in what became the Great Northern War. Sweden fought bravely, but the famine had drained its reserves. The empire that once dominated the Baltic began to crumble. It never fully recovered, and the story of its decline traces back to those bitter, frozen years. While Sweden struggled through its icy crisis, another kingdom to the south faced its own test of endurance. France in the 1690s was the most powerful state in Europe, ruled by the ambitious Louis XIV. But even the Sun King could not command the weather. The decade brought a series of bitter harvest failures year after year. Cold springs and wet summers ruined grain fields across the countryside. What began as a difficult season turned into a prolonged disaster. By 1693, the price of bread had soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. And Louis XIV was still fighting costly wars to expand his borders. The royal treasury demanded more taxes while the land produced less food. Peasants found themselves caught between hunger and the tax collector. They sold their tools, their animals, even the seed grain meant for next year's planting. Nothing helped. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the crisis was too vast for local charity. In the worst affected provinces, records show that many families simply vanished from the tax rolls. They had no food and no way to pay. Desperation turned to anger. Small uprisings flared across the countryside. Peasants marched on the estates of nobles and demanded grain. They blocked roads and refused to pay the hated taxes. The crown sent soldiers to restore order, but the revolts kept spreading. Each rebellion cost money to suppress, and each failed harvest reduced the taxes the crown could collect. Louis XIV refused to change his policies. He poured more gold into his wars, believing that military glory would secure his legacy. Instead, he drained the treasury dry. The famine did not end quickly. It dragged on through the decade, returning again in 1698 and 1699. By the time the rains finally steadied, France had lost perhaps 2 million of its people to hunger and the illnesses that follow it. The royal finances never recovered. The debt mounted, and later kings would struggle to pay the interest. That long financial wound festered for nearly a century, weakening the monarchy's grip. When another crisis struck in the late 1780s, the government was already too broke to manage it. The anger that had simmered in the 1690s boiled over into revolution. The famine under Louis XIV did not cause the French Revolution by itself, but it cracked the foundation of royal authority, and once that crack appeared, nothing could seal it. In the same decade that France bled, another empire faced its own crisis. Spain under Philip II was the wealthiest kingdom in Europe, its treasury filled with silver from the Americas. But that wealth hid a fatal weakness. The land of Castile, the heart of the empire, had never been rich in grain. Its soil was thin, its rainfall unreliable. For decades, the crown had depended on imported food to feed its growing population. Then came the 1590s. A series of harsh winters and dry summers struck the Iberian Peninsula. The harvests failed, not once but repeatedly. Across Castile, the fields that had barely supported the people now produced almost nothing. Grain prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. And Philip II was pouring his silver into wars across Europe. He fought the Dutch rebels in the Low Countries, battled the English navy, and sent the Great Armada to its ruin. Every campaign demanded more taxes, more soldiers, more supplies. The crown borrowed heavily from foreign bankers, promising future silver as collateral. But the silver shipments from the Americas grew irregular, and the loans fell due. Meanwhile, the people of Castile had no bread. The health challenges of the era forced communities to share what little they had, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed local charity. Villages emptied as families fled to the cities, only to find the same hunger waiting there. The kingdom's population, already strained by decades of war, began to shrink. The tax base eroded with every empty house. Philip II could not both feed his people and fund his armies. He chose the armies. He pushed the war effort forward, demanding even more from the starving countryside. The soldiers went unpaid for months, then mutinied. The Spanish tercios, once the finest infantry in Europe, began to lose their edge. The crown defaulted on its debts, shaking the faith of bankers across the continent. And still the famine continued year after year until the end of the decade. By the time the rains returned and the fields recovered, Castile had lost perhaps 500,000 people. The economic damage was permanent. The Spanish Habsburg Empire had overreached. It could no longer afford to dominate Europe. Within a generation, Spain would sign the Peace of Westphalia and withdraw from the great continental struggles. The famine of the 1590s did not end the Spanish Golden Age overnight, but it hollowed out the kingdom from within. The silver that once built cathedrals and armadas now flowed through the hands of foreign creditors. And the countryside, once the source of Spain's strength, never fully recovered its people or its grain. Across the globe, a different empire crumbled under the weight of hunger. The Mughal Empire in India had once been one of the wealthiest and most magnificent kingdoms on earth. By the late 1700s, however, its power had faded. The central government in Delhi had grown weak. Provincial governors ruled with near independence. The great armies that once commanded respect had shrunk. And into this fragile landscape came a disaster that would seal the empire's fate. In the Deccan region of central and southern India, the monsoon rains failed in 1789. Year after year, the skies remained stubbornly clear. The dry season stretched into months, then into years. The great rivers that depended on the monsoon shrank to muddy trickles. Wells dried up. The reservoirs and tanks that farmers had built over centuries to capture rainwater turned into cracked, empty bowls. The soil hardened into dust. Nothing could grow. The people of the Deccan had lived with occasional drought before, but this was different. The failure of the rains did not last one season or even two. It persisted for 4 long years, from 1789 to 1793. Across the region, entire harvests vanished. Grain stores that had held reserves for lean times were soon exhausted. Prices for food climbed far beyond what ordinary families could afford. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the crisis was so vast that local networks of support broke down entirely. Villages emptied as people set out in search of food, only to find the same scarcity waiting along every road. The great cities of the Deccan, such as Pune and Hyderabad, saw crowds of desperate families gather at their gates, hoping for relief that never came. The Mughal emperor in Delhi, Shah Alam II, was a ruler in name only. His authority barely extended beyond the walls of his own palace. The provinces answered to their own nawabs and local chieftains, who had little incentive to send aid to distant regions. There was no imperial administration capable of organizing a coordinated response, no central grain reserves to distribute, no tax relief for farmers who had lost everything. The Mughal system, once famous for its efficient revenue collection and its networks of granaries, had fallen into paralysis. When a crisis of this magnitude struck, there was no one to turn to. The empire had become hollow, unable to protect its own people, and this is where another power stepped into the vacuum. The British East India Company, originally a trading enterprise, had been quietly expanding its influence across the subcontinent for decades. It controlled territories in Bengal and along the coasts. It maintained its own armies, staffed by Indian soldiers trained in European tactics, and crucially, it had a functioning administration that could mobilize resources. When the famine struck the Deccan, the company did not rush in with charity, but it did recognize an opportunity. The local rulers who survived the disaster emerged weakened, their treasuries drained, their populations decimated, their authority eroded. They needed money and support. The East India Company was ready to offer both at a price. In the years that followed the famine, the company extended its influence deeper into the Deccan. It signed treaties with depleted princely states, offering protection in exchange for control over trade and revenue. It provided loans that could never be fully repaid, creating relationships of dependency. It stepped in to collect taxes in regions where local governments had collapsed. By the time the drought finally ended and the rains returned, the balance of power had shifted permanently. The old Mughal order, already fragile, had been shattered by the famine. The British East India Company filled the void. The Doji-Bara famine did not cause British rule in India by itself. The company had been expanding for decades before 1789, and it would continue to expand for decades after, but the famine was a turning point. It exposed the complete inability of the Mughal system to respond to crisis. It demonstrated to local rulers and to the people of the Deccan that the old empire could no longer protect them. And it gave the East India Company the opening it needed to move from a commercial enterprise into a territorial power. Within 60 years, the company would control nearly the entire subcontinent. The empire that had once rivaled any on earth would be reduced to a memory, and the suffering of those 4 dry years had made it possible. In 1769, the rains failed over Bengal. The monsoon, which had always arrived with dependable rhythm, did not come as expected. The rivers shrank, the rice paddies dried and cracked, and the green fields turned brown. For the people of one of the most fertile regions on earth, the drought was a disaster. But what followed was not just a natural calamity. It became a catastrophic famine that would kill millions and forever change the relationship between India and Britain. At the time, the British East India Company had controlled Bengal for just over a decade. It had taken over the right to collect taxes and administer the province after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The company saw Bengal as a source of revenue to fund its growing military power and trade. Its officials demanded ever higher tax payments from the farmers, even as the crops failed. The land revenue was fixed, and the collectors had no intention of reducing it. Farmers who could not pay were forced to sell their tools, their animals, even their own small plots of land. Many lost everything. Worse still, the company continued to export grain from Bengal to other parts of India and to Europe, even while local villagers starved. Company merchants and their Indian agents hoarded rice, waiting for prices to rise even higher. They made enormous profits from the suffering around them. The government in Calcutta, the company's capital, did almost nothing to stop the trade or to distribute relief. A few private individuals, including some Indian bankers, tried to set up soup kitchens and grain distribution centers, but they were overwhelmed. The company itself did not open its own granaries, it did not halt exports, it did not reduce its tax demands. As the famine stretched into its second year, the death toll climbed. Entire villages were abandoned, Fields lay untended, which meant that even when the rains finally returned in 1771, there was no one left to plant the next season's crop. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the scale of the loss was so immense that local bonds of charity and kinship were completely overwhelmed. Historians estimate that over the course of the famine between 1769 and 1773, somewhere between 8 and 10 million people passed away in Bengal alone. That number is difficult to grasp. It represents more than a third of the region's population at the time. News of the catastrophe eventually reached London. It spread slowly, carried by letters from company officials, by returning merchants, and by a few reporters who dared to write about what they had seen. The stories were shocking. People spoke of fields littered with the remains of those who had fallen from exhaustion. They told of mothers unable to feed their children, of entire districts stripped of life. The British public, which had generally supported the company's expansion, began to turn against it. Critics in Parliament accused the company of greed, corruption, and outright cruelty. The outcry forced the British government to act. In 1773, Parliament passed the Regulating Act, the first serious attempt to bring the East India Company under government control. The act created a new position, the Governor-General of Bengal, who would oversee the company's operations and report to London. It also established a Supreme Court in Calcutta to hear cases involving company officials. For the first time, the company was no longer completely free to do as it pleased in India. The British Crown was beginning to step in. The Regulating Act did not end the company's abuses overnight. Corruption and exploitation continued for decades, but it was a crucial turning point. Before the Bengal famine, the company had operated as a private trading enterprise, answerable only to its shareholders. After the famine, it became a semi-colonial administration, answerable to Parliament and the Crown. The disaster made it impossible to ignore the fact that the company was governing millions of people and that it needed to be held accountable. The Great Bengal Famine of 1769 to 1773 did not bring British imperial rule into existence on its own, but it did force the British government to accept responsibility for what happened in India. That acceptance would lead, over the next 80 years, to the full imposition of the British Raj, and it all began with a drought, a few missed monsoons, and a company that chose profit over people. The British East India Company learned from its experience in Bengal, but it did not change its ways. By the late 1830s, the company had found another lucrative trade. It was smuggling opium from British India into China, despite Chinese laws that strictly forbade the drug. The Qing dynasty tried to stop the flow, confiscating and destroying thousands of chests of opium. Britain responded with naval force, launching the First Opium War in 1839. The conflict lasted 3 years and it ended in a humiliating defeat for China. The Treaty of Nanking forced the king to cede Hong Kong, open 5 ports to British trade, and pay a huge indemnity, but the war itself was only part of the disaster. While the British fleet bombarded coastal forts and blockaded harbors, a natural crisis was building inland. The Yangtze River, the lifeblood of central China, flooded catastrophically in 1840. The waters rose higher than anyone remembered, submerging thousands of square miles of farmland. The flood destroyed the summer harvest. Rice paddies became lakes. Villages washed away, and then, with the crops destroyed and the granaries already emptied by war taxes, famine spread across the coastal provinces. The same regions that had supplied food to the capital now produced nothing. The Qing government, already strained by the cost of fighting the British, could not organize effective relief. Officials in Beijing had little control over local magistrates, many of whom hoarded grain or demanded bribes for access to dwindling supplies. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the crisis was made worse by the government's own weakness. Peasants who had lost everything could not pay their taxes, yet the tax collectors still demanded payment. Those who could not pay were beaten or imprisoned. Some fled to the cities only to find the same hunger waiting there. The death toll from the famine surpassed the losses on the battlefield many times over. Historians estimate that in the hardest hit areas, perhaps a quarter of the population passed away during those few years. The famine did more than empty villages. It cracked the foundation of the Qing dynasty's legitimacy. For centuries, the emperor had been seen as the son of heaven, responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. A good ruler ensured good harvests. When the crops failed repeatedly, and when the government proved unable to help, ordinary people began to question the mandate of heaven. Secret societies and rebel groups grew stronger. Peasant uprisings flared across the south. The king had shown its weakness, not only in losing a war to a foreign power, but in failing to protect its own people from hunger. And the British were watching. They had seen how easily they could defeat China's outdated fleets and forts. They had forced open the treaty ports, and they had witnessed the famine drain the empire's strength. The defeat in the Opium War forced China to pay indemnities that emptied the treasury, while the famine emptied the countryside. Together, they created a downward spiral of debt and hunger that the king never fully escaped. Within a decade, the Taiping Rebellion would erupt, the deadliest civil war in history, fueled in large part by the grievances born from these years of scarcity. The Opium War famine did not destroy the Qing Empire by itself, but it exposed every crack in its armor, and those cracks would never be sealed. A single crop defined the fate of an entire nation, and when that crop vanished, the nation would never be the same. The potato had become the backbone of Irish life by the early 1800s. It grew well in the cool, damp climate. It produced more calories per acre than grain. For the majority of the rural population, especially the poor tenant farmers who worked small plots of land, the potato was nearly the only food they ate. A family could survive on an acre of potatoes with a little milk or fish on the side. But that reliance also made them dangerously vulnerable. When a strange blight appeared in the autumn of 1845, it spread through the potato fields like a shadow passing over the land. The leaves turned black and rotted. The tubers underground turned into a slimy, stinking mess. The first year was bad, but the next year was worse. The blight returned in 1846, destroying nearly the entire crop across the island. And it kept coming back year after year until 1852. The potato, the foundation of Irish sustenance, had simply disappeared. The British government at the time ruled Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Its officials in London knew what was happening. Reports from local administrators described the horror unfolding in the countryside, yet the response was shockingly inadequate. Some relief efforts were attempted, public works programs and soup kitchens, but they were too small and too slow. The government held to a strict economic philosophy that the market should be left alone and that aid would create dependency. So while the Irish starved, food continued to be exported from the island. Ships carrying grain and livestock sailed from Irish ports to England because the law required tenants to pay their rent and the landlords wanted their money. The crops that could have fed the hungry were sold abroad instead. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the crisis was met with indifference from the very government that claimed authority over the land. The toll was devastating. Over the course of the famine, Ireland lost a staggering portion of its population. Some passed away from hunger and the illnesses that followed. Others, desperate for any chance at survival, boarded overcrowded ships bound for North America and Britain. The emigration was not a trickle, it was a flood. Between 1845 and 1855, more than 1 million people left Ireland. The population that had been over 8 million before the famine plummeted to around 6.5 million within a decade. And the decline did not stop there. The empty villages, the abandoned fields, the silent cottages all told the same story. A way of life had been erased. But from that devastation grew a powerful new force. The famine burned into the collective memory of the Irish people. They remembered who had failed them. They remembered the landlords who evicted families unable to pay rent. They remembered the British government that had preached self-reliance while people died. The anger and resentment that had simmered for centuries under British rule now boiled over into a fierce determination. The desire for independence, for control over their own land and their own destiny, became the central cause of Irish politics. Organizations that had once called for moderate reform gave way to movements demanding full self-rule. The language of nationalism spread through the countryside and into the Irish communities abroad. The famine had not only killed millions, it had planted the seeds of revolution. In the decades that followed, Irish nationalists grew more organized and more militant. They formed political parties, staged protests, and eventually took up arms. The Easter Rising of 1916 was a direct challenge to British authority, and though it was crushed, it inspired a wave of support. The War of Independence that followed from 1919 to 1921 finally forced the British government to negotiate. In 1922, the Irish Free State was born, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. It was not yet a fully independent republic, but it was a giant step away from the union that had failed Ireland so terribly. The famine of the 1840s did not cause the Irish Revolution by itself, but it hollowed out the old order and filled the void with a burning need for change. The fields that had once grown potatoes now grew a nation's determination, and that determination would eventually reshape the map of the British Isles. In the same decade, a global weather pattern set two empires on a collision course with hunger. The El Niño phenomenon, a shift in ocean temperatures that disrupts rainfall across the tropics, struck with unusual force in the mid-1870s. For 3 consecutive years, from 1876 to 1878, the monsoon rains failed over vast stretches of British India and Qing China. The heartlands of both empires turned to dust. In the Deccan Plateau of India, where the famine had already struck a century earlier, the wells dried again. The reservoirs that had been rebuilt after the Doji Bara famine cracked open. The rice paddies of the Madras Presidency and the Bombay Presidency produced nothing. In northern China, the Great Plains along the Yellow River saw the same dry skies. The winter wheat shriveled in the fields, the spring rains never arrived. What made this crisis different from earlier famines was its sheer scale. It was not one region suffering while another remained untouched. It was a synchronized collapse of the food supply across 2 of the most populous regions on Earth. The British government in India, still reeling from the cost of the Afghan wars and the strain of administering a growing empire, responded with a philosophy of non-interference. Officials in London and Calcutta believed that the market would solve the problem if left alone. They argued that direct relief would create dependence and that charity would undermine the character of the people, a phrase that echoed the same logic used during the Irish famine. In practice, this meant that grain exports from India to Britain continued at nearly full volume. Ships carrying wheat and rice sailed from Indian ports to feed the factories and cities of the empire while the countryside starved. The government did organize some public works projects, building roads and canals in exchange for wages, but the scale was far too small. The wages were too low, and the work sites were often far from where the hungry lived. Thousands walked for days only to find no work or no food. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the official response was so cold and so slow that local networks of charity could not hold. The death toll in India alone is estimated to have been between 5 and 10 million people. Across the Bay of Bengal in Qing China, the situation was even more desperate. The empire had never fully recovered from the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars. Its treasury was empty, its bureaucracy was corrupt and inefficient. When the drought struck the provinces of Shaanxi, Henan, and Hebei, the central government could barely muster a response. Local magistrates who tried to distribute grain were often blocked by the military governors who controlled the regions. The Yellow River itself ran so low that boats could not navigate it, cutting off the usual supply routes. In Shaanxi province alone, perhaps half the population passed away during the famine years. The health challenges of the era forced families to make impossible choices, and many sold their land, their tools, and even their children in a desperate attempt to find food. The Qing government, already weakened, could not prevent the collapse, and as the famine dragged on, resentment against the ruling dynasty grew. Secret societies that had been suppressed for years began to reorganize. Peasant bands formed to raid the granaries of wealthy landlords. In the years that followed, these groups would coalesce into the Boxer movement, a rebellion that directly threatened foreign interests and the Qing throne. The famine of 1876 to 1878 did not cause the Boxer rebellion by itself, but it emptied the countryside of hope and filled it with anger. In British India, the consequences were political as well. The famine sparked a wave of criticism, not only from Indian intellectuals but also from British journalists and missionaries who traveled through the affected regions and wrote damning accounts. They described officials who collected taxes from skeletons, who exported grain while children died. The British public, still haunted by the memory of the Irish famine, began to question the moral authority of the empire. In response, the colonial government appointed a famine commission in 1880, which recommended more active intervention in future crises, including the creation of a system of famine codes and relief works. But the damage had been done. Indian reformers began to organize. They formed associations, published newspapers, and demanded a voice in the government that ruled them. The Indian National Congress held its first meeting in 1885, just 7 years after the famine ended. The leaders who gathered in Bombay were not revolutionaries, not yet, but they were united by a shared conviction that an empire which failed to protect its people from hunger had no right to rule. The Great Drought Famine of the late 1870s was a global event, a planetary crisis that exposed the weaknesses of two vast empires. One, the Qing, would stagger on for another 3 decades before falling to revolution. The other, the British Raj, would survive longer, but the seeds of its end had been planted in the dust of those dry years. The monsoon had failed, and so had the old order. The new century brought no mercy to the fields of central and western India. Between 1900 and 1903, the monsoon failed again, turning the landscapes of the Bombay Presidency and the princely states of Rajputana into a parched wasteland. The rains that normally arrived in June and July did not come, or came so weakly that the soil never softened. Crops that had been sown with hope withered before they could produce a single ear of grain. The drought struck region after region, spreading like a slow burn across the Deccan and into the dry interior. The people of these lands had endured scarcity before, but not like this. The failure was not a single bad season, but a relentless cycle of dry years. The first year stripped the reserves, the second year emptied the granaries. The third year left nothing at all. By the time the famine reached its peak in 1901, the scale of suffering had become impossible to ignore. The British colonial government, still stung by the global criticism of the earlier famine in the 1870s, had created a system of famine codes. These were detailed instructions for how officials should respond to crop failures. They called for early warning, for the opening of relief works, and for the distribution of food grains at controlled prices. In theory, this was a major step forward. The government had learned, or at least appeared to learn, from its past mistakes. In practice, the implementation was uneven and often cruel. The relief works were set up, but they required long hours of hard labor for very little pay. The wages were calculated at a level designed to prevent starvation, but nothing more. The work sites were often far from the villages, forcing exhausted people to walk for days just to reach them. The grain that was distributed was sometimes of poor quality, and the quantities were meager. The government also insisted on a policy of non-interference with private trade, meaning that merchants could still export grain from the affected regions if they chose to. And many did choose to because the prices in other markets were higher. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the official response was still shaped by a deep reluctance to appear too generous. Officials in London and Calcutta worried that giving too much aid would make the Indian people dependent on charity, so they gave just enough to keep the death toll from reaching the catastrophic numbers of the previous century, but not enough to prevent immense suffering. Over the course of the famine, more than 1 million people passed away. The exact number is difficult to determine, but the records show a devastating toll. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow. The land that had once supported thriving communities became a landscape of memory, yet the famine also sparked a change. The government, pressured by reformers in Britain and by growing criticism from Indian intellectuals, began to invest in long-term solutions. The most visible of these was the expansion of irrigation. Canals were dug, reservoirs were built, and new systems of water management were introduced across the arid regions of western and central India. The hope was that by storing water from the monsoon, the land could survive a dry year. These projects were not motivated purely by compassion. They were also strategic. A region that could feed itself was less likely to become a source of unrest. And unrest was something the British feared more than almost anything else. The Indian independence movement, which had been slowly gathering strength since the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885, found new energy in the aftermath of the famine. The suffering of the people had been witnessed by a generation of Indian leaders who had traveled to the affected regions and seen the inadequacy of the colonial response. They wrote articles, gave speeches, and organized relief efforts of their own. They argued that an empire that could not protect its subjects from hunger had no moral right to rule. The famine of 1900 to 1903 did not topple the British Raj, but it planted something deeper. It planted the conviction among a growing number of Indians that only self-rule could ensure that their people would never again be left to starve while the empire debated policy. The irrigation canals and the famine codes were improvements, but they were improvements made by a foreign power, and that foreign power had proven, again and again, that its first priority was not the welfare of the Indian people but the stability of the empire. The seeds of independence had been watered by the tears of 1 million lost lives, and those seeds would one day grow into a movement that could not be stopped. A revolution could not shield Russia from the winter of 1921. The Bolsheviks had seized power 4 years earlier, promising peace, land, and bread. But by the time the snow melted across the Volga region, those promises had turned to dust. The Russian Civil War had torn through the countryside for 3 brutal years. Armies had crisscrossed the land, seizing grain, burning villages, and conscripting men. The agricultural heartland of the empire was exhausted. Fields had been left untended. Horses and oxen, the muscle of the farm, had been taken by the war. And then, in the summer of 1920, the rain simply stopped. The Volga region, a vast stretch of fertile land that had fed much of Russia, turned dry and hard. The winter wheat that farmers had planted with hope never emerged from the soil. The spring planting, when it came, produced almost nothing. The drought did not last 1 season. It lingered through the following year, turning a bad harvest into a catastrophe. By the spring of 1921, the situation had become desperate. But the famine was not only a natural disaster, it was also a political one. During the Civil War, the Bolshevik government had implemented a policy known as war communism. Under this system, the state requisitioned grain directly from the peasants, often at gunpoint, paying them with worthless paper currency or nothing at all. The idea was to feed the Red Army and the industrial workers in the cities. The reality was that the peasants, especially the more prosperous ones, saw no incentive to grow more than they needed for their own survival. They hid their grain, reduced their planting, and in some cases actively resisted the collectors. When the drought struck, the reserves that might have cushioned the blow were already gone. There was no surplus to draw on. The fields that had been neglected during the war produced even less than they would have otherwise. The policies of the state, designed to extract every possible resource, had stripped the countryside of its resilience. The Volga region, once a breadbasket, became a landscape of hunger. The health challenges of the era forced families to make impossible decisions. Some ate the seed grain meant for the next season, destroying any hope of recovery. Others boiled grass and tree bark just to fill their stomachs. Reports from the time describe how entire villages fell silent. The chaos of the civil war had already displaced millions. Now famine turned displacement into a flood. Starving families streamed toward the cities, hoping for relief. They walked along roads lined with the remains of those who had collapsed before them. The Bolshevik government, still fighting to consolidate its power, was overwhelmed. It did not have the grain stores, the transportation network, or the administrative capacity to feed the hungry. And yet the famine forced a reckoning. Lenin, the leader of the revolution, was a pragmatist at his core. He saw that the countryside was in open revolt. Peasant uprisings had flared across the Volga region, in Ukraine, and even in Siberia. The sailors of Kronstadt, once among the most loyal supporters of the Bolsheviks, had risen up in March of 1921, demanding bread and political freedom. The Red Army had crushed the rebellion, but the message was clear. The regime was losing control. Something had to change. In March of 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin announced a dramatic shift. War communism was abandoned. In its place came the new economic policy, or NEP. The state would still control the commanding heights of the economy, large industry, banking, and foreign trade. But peasants would now be allowed to sell their surplus grain on the open market. Private trade was legalized. Small businesses could operate again. The state requisitions, the hated grain seizures, ended. Instead, the government imposed a fixed tax in kind, a set amount of grain that peasants knew in advance and could plan around. Anything they produced beyond that tax was theirs to keep and to sell. The change was immediate and profound. Peasants began to plant more. Markets reappeared in towns and villages. Food slowly began to flow again. The new economic policy did not end the famine overnight. The damage of the drought and the civil war was too deep for a quick fix, but it prevented the crisis from consuming the entire country, and more importantly, it saved the Bolshevik regime. The party had been on the verge of collapse, its support base in the countryside destroyed by its own policies. The NEP rebuilt that support, or at least neutralized the opposition. Peasants who had been ready to fight the state now had a reason to cooperate. The threat of a peasant war, which could have toppled the fragile Soviet government, receded. Lenin had made a strategic retreat. He described it as a necessary breathing spell, a temporary concession to capitalism in order to preserve the socialist project. The retreat worked. The Bolsheviks survived. The famine of 1921 to 1922 did not destroy the Soviet state, it reshaped it. It forced the revolutionaries to confront the limits of their power. They had imagined that they could simply command the economy to produce what they needed. The land, the seasons, and the will of the people had proven otherwise. The NEP was a lesson in humility, a recognition that ideology must sometimes yield to reality. That lesson would not last forever. Within a decade, Stalin would dismantle the NEP and impose collectivization, triggering an even greater catastrophe. But in the early 1920s, the retreat bought time. It gave the Soviet government the stability it needed to rebuild its army, its industry, and its grip on power. The Volga famine had been a terrible price to pay for that lesson, but the Bolsheviks, unlike so many empires before them, had learned to bend before they broke. And so they endured. The breathing spell of the new economic policy did not last forever. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin had consolidated his grip on the Soviet Union. He rejected Lenin's cautious retreat and pushed for rapid industrialization and the full collectivization of agriculture. The state would take direct control of the land, merging small peasant holdings into large collective farms. Grain would be seized to feed the growing cities and to export for foreign currency, which would buy the machinery needed for factories. The plan was ambitious and it was enforced with brutal speed. Peasants who resisted were labeled as wealthy exploiters, a term that often meant little more than owning a cow or a plow. Their property was confiscated. Many were driven from their homes and sent to remote labor camps. The countryside, especially in Ukraine, which had long been the breadbasket of the empire, erupted in chaos. Farmers slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over. They burned their crops in defiance. They planted less, hoping to starve the state's demands. But the state did not relent. In 1932, the harvest across Ukraine was poor, the result of drought and the turmoil of collectivization. Yet the quotas for grain requisition remained impossibly high. Stalin and his officials in Moscow refused to lower them. They insisted that the grain must be taken, even if it meant leaving nothing for the people who had grown it. The machinery of the state swept through the villages, seizing every kernel of grain it could find. Storage bins were emptied, hidden caches were discovered. Even the seed grain meant for the next planting was taken. The result was a catastrophe of staggering proportions. Over the winter of 1932 and into 1933, a vast famine spread across Ukraine. Entire districts became silent. Families who had no food and no way to get it watched the fields lie barren around them. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but here the crisis was compounded by the deliberate policy of the state. Travel was restricted. People were not allowed to leave their villages in search of food. Those who tried were turned back by roadblocks and patrols. The outside world heard little of what was happening. Soviet authorities denied the famine existed and suppressed all reports. The toll was immense. Historians estimate that millions of people passed away in Ukraine during those years. The exact number remains a subject of study and debate, but the scale of loss was deep enough to reshape the nation's memory. Villages lost entire generations. Traditions and songs that had been passed down for centuries fell silent. The famine did more than empty the land. It struck at the heart of Ukrainian identity. For centuries, Ukraine had been a distinct culture within the Russian Empire, with its own language, literature, and sense of nationhood. The Soviet government viewed this identity with suspicion. It saw Ukrainian nationalism as a threat to the unity of the Soviet state. The famine, by destroying the rural population that formed the backbone of that identity, served a purpose beyond feeding the cities. It weakened the very foundations of Ukrainian separatism. The trauma of those years was not spoken of openly for decades. It was carried in silence in the memories of survivors, in the empty spaces of family trees. But that silence did not mean forgetting. The experience became a deep wound in the collective consciousness of the Ukrainian people. When the Soviet Union began to weaken in the 1980s, that wound began to break open. Historians and activists started to uncover the records of the famine. They gave it a name, Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. The word itself carried the weight of a buried history. The revelation sparked a powerful resurgence of Ukrainian national feeling. People began to demand recognition of what had happened, and with that demand came a renewed sense of identity. The famine became a rallying point, a symbol of the suffering inflicted by a foreign power. It was no longer a hidden tragedy. It was a central story of the nation's struggle for survival. When Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the memory of the Holodomor was part of the foundation. The nation that emerged from the collapse of the USSR was shaped by that trauma. The loss of millions had forged a determination that the country would never again be ruled by a power that treated its people as expendable. The man-made famine of 1932 to 1933 did not create Ukrainian nationalism overnight. But it burned into the national soul a warning and a promise. The warning was about what happens when a people are stripped of their land and their voice. The promise was that memory itself could become a force for freedom. The shadow of war fell over the eastern coast of India in 1943. The Second World War was raging across the globe, and the British Empire, fighting for its survival, had turned the subcontinent into a vast military staging ground. Troops were stationed in every major city. Supplies were stockpiled for the campaigns in Burma and the Pacific, and in the province of Bengal, a region already strained by the demands of the conflict, a cyclone struck in October of 1942. The storm surged across the delta, flattening villages, destroying rice paddies, and flooding the low-lying fields with salt water. The harvest that should have fed millions was ruined. The disaster was not the cause of the famine that followed, but it was the first crack in a dam that was already weakening. The war had already disrupted the usual flow of food. Ships that once carried grain from Burma were now commandeered for military transport. The Japanese occupation of Burma in early 1942 cut off the supply of rice that Bengal had long relied on. The colonial government in Calcutta, fearing a Japanese invasion, had also adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying boats and grain stores in the coastal regions to deny them to the enemy. The fishermen and farmers who depended on those boats lost their livelihood. The fields that should have been planted lay fallow, and then the cyclone delivered the final blow to what remained. The health challenges of the era were compounded by a political decision that would haunt the empire. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, refused to divert food supplies from other theaters of war to relieve Bengal. Churchill argued that the famine was the result of overpopulation and that the Indian people should learn to feed themselves. In London, officials worried that shipping grain to Bengal would slow down the war effort. The priority was victory, not charity. Meanwhile, in Calcutta, the colonial administration imposed strict controls on the movement of grain, but the system was riddled with corruption. Local merchants hoarded rice, driving prices far beyond the reach of ordinary families. Government officials, both British and Indian, profited from the black market. The people who had no money, no land, and no connections were left to starve. The health challenges of the era forced communities to share what little they had, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed even the strongest bonds of family and village. People left their homes and walked toward the cities, hoping for relief. They gathered in the streets of Calcutta, where they filled the pavements and the doorways. The government set up a few relief kitchens, but the effort was too little and too late. The war had consumed every resource. Over the course of 1943, more than 2 million people passed away. The exact number remains difficult to determine, but the scale of loss was devastating. Villages in the countryside were emptied. Families who had farmed the same land for generations vanished. The famine did not end quickly. It stretched into 1944, and the scars remained for years, but the most lasting impact was not measured in empty fields. It was measured in the hearts of the people who survived. The Indian public had long been divided over the question of independence. Some supported the British war effort, hoping to earn a measure of self-rule in return. Others, led by the Indian National Congress, had launched the Quit India movement in 1942, demanding immediate independence. The British response had been to arrest the leaders and crack down on protests. The famine changed everything. The famine was not a natural disaster. It was a political failure. The comparison was impossible to ignore. Grain was still being exported from India to feed British soldiers and to supply Allied forces in the Middle East and Africa while Indians starved. The newspapers in Calcutta and across the country published photographs and reports that could not be suppressed. The images of the suffering on the streets were circulated, not only in India but also in Britain and the United States. The world saw what was happening, and the moral authority of the British Empire, already weakened by decades of nationalist criticism, crumbled away. Indian soldiers who had fought for the empire in North Africa and Europe returned home to find their families destroyed by a famine that the government had refused to prevent. The anger spread from the villages into the ranks of the army itself, a force that had remained largely loyal until then. The British government tried to deflect blame, pointing to the war, the Japanese, and the weather. But the Indian people knew the truth. The empire had chosen its own survival over theirs. The famine did not single-handedly end British rule in India, but it was a decisive turning point. The demand for independence became louder and more unified. Moderate voices that had once called for gradual reform were drowned out by those who insisted on immediate freedom. The British, exhausted by the war and facing a growing crisis of legitimacy, could no longer maintain their grip. In 1947, just 4 years after the famine, the British Raj came to an end. The partition of India was violent and painful, but the empire was gone. The famine of 1943 had been a final, terrible lesson for the Indian people. They could not trust a foreign power to protect them. And so they took their fate into their own hands. The world had witnessed empires crumble under the weight of hunger before, but nothing compared to what unfolded in China at the end of the 1950s. The Great Leap Forward was Mao Zedong's ambitious plan to transform China from a poor agricultural society into a modern industrial power overnight. Millions of peasants were pulled from their fields and sent to build steel furnaces in their backyards. They melted down plows, pots, and even cooking tools, believing that production would skyrocket, but the fields that had fed the nation were left untended. The harvests that should have been gathered rotted where they stood, and then the weather turned against them. Drought struck the northern provinces. Floods washed away the crops in the south. The combination of human error and natural disaster created a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. The state's own reporting system made everything worse. Local officials, terrified of being accused of disloyalty, exaggerated the harvest numbers to please their superiors. The central government believed that there was plenty of grain, so it continued to demand high quotas for export to the cities and to pay for industrial imports. The grain that should have stayed in the countryside was taken away. The people who had grown it were left with nothing. Over the next 3 years, from 1959 to 1961, the landscape of rural China changed forever. Villages that had stood for centuries fell silent. Families who had worked the same plots of land for generations disappeared from the records. Historians continue to study this period to understand exactly how many lives were lost. The numbers are staggering, and the scale of the tragedy has made it one of the most studied events in modern history. The famine did more than empty the countryside. It shattered the faith of the rural population in the policies that had caused their suffering. Peasants who had once supported the revolution now saw the government as a distant force that did not understand their lives. The unrest that followed forced the leadership in Beijing to reconsider its approach. By 1962, the radical policies of the Great Leap were quietly abandoned. Private plots were allowed again. Farmers were permitted to sell surplus goods at local markets. The state retreated from its most extreme demands and allowed the countryside to recover. The damage had been done, but the lessons were not entirely lost. The institutional memory of those years stayed with the generation that lived through them. When Deng Xiaoping rose to power in the late 1970s, he carried with him the knowledge of what happens when ideology ignores reality. The economic reforms that transformed China in the decades that followed were shaped by that memory. The household responsibility system, which gave farmers control over their own land and production, was a direct response to the failures of the Great Leap Forward. The famine had not only set back China's development, it had also planted the seeds of a more pragmatic approach to governance, one that would eventually lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. It was a terrible price to pay for that lesson, but it was a lesson that would shape the future of the most populous nation on earth. The Ottoman Empire weathered many storms, but the cold of the 1690s broke something essential. Winter after winter, the temperatures across Anatolia and the Balkans dropped lower than anyone remembered. Snow lingered deep into spring, and the frost returned before autumn had a chance to ripen the crops. The drought that followed in the summers turned fields into cracked earth. The grain that had sustained the empire's vast cities, its armies, and its tax base simply did not grow. The harvests failed not once but repeatedly, year after year, until the granaries that had held reserves for emergencies were empty. The people of the countryside, who had always been the foundation of the Ottoman system, faced a choice that no farmer should ever have to make. They could eat their seed grain and survive the winter, but that would mean no planting in the spring, or they could save the seed and watch their children go hungry. Across the empire, families began to drift toward the towns, hoping for relief that rarely came. The capital, Istanbul, was not spared. The city of 1 million souls depended on grain shipments from Egypt and the Danube region. But those shipments shrank as the provinces struggled to feed themselves. The price of bread in the city rose higher than any living Ottoman could remember. The government tried to control prices and distribute grain from its own stores, but the stores were soon exhausted. The janissaries, the elite soldiers who had once been the empire's pride, grew restless. They were paid in debased coin, and even that coin could buy less and less. The Sultan, Mustafa II, watched his authority erode as the famine deepened. The empire was already fighting a long and costly war against the Habsburgs of Austria. The war had drained the treasury and demanded heavy taxes. Now, with the famine reducing the tax base, the government could not pay its soldiers or its officials. The military campaigns that had once expanded Ottoman territory stalled and then reversed. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 would formally mark the empire's first major territorial loss in Europe, ceding Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs. But the seeds of that defeat had been sown in the empty fields of the famine years. The Austrian armies were not the only threat. Within the empire, a wave of revolts known as the Salali Rebellion swept through Anatolia. These were not organized uprisings with a single leader. They were a chain of local revolts driven by peasants and soldiers who had been displaced by the famine, dispossessed by the tax collectors, and driven to desperation. Bands of armed men roamed the countryside, attacking caravans, raiding villages, and sometimes seizing control of entire towns. The government sent troops to suppress them, but those troops were often just as hungry and just as likely to join the rebels. The revolts did not end quickly. They persisted into the early 1700s, wearing down the central authority and leaving wide stretches of Anatolia beyond the Sultan's control. The famine had cracked the old order. The Devshirme system, which had long supplied the empire with loyal administrators and soldiers, was already in decline. The land tenure system that had tied peasants to the land and ensured a steady flow of taxes was breaking apart. The famine accelerated every one of these fractures. Villages that had been abandoned never recovered. Fields that had gone untended for years grew wild. The tax revenues that the state depended on never returned to their former levels. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse overnight, but the 1690s marked the beginning of a long, slow descent. The golden age of Suleiman the Magnificent was a distant memory. The empire that had once terrified Europe was now on the defensive, struggling to hold its borders and feed its people. The cold winters of that decade had not only frozen the ground. They had frozen the empire's momentum, and the thaw that followed did not bring new growth. It brought a long autumn of decline, one that would last for more than 2 centuries. The famine of the 1690s did not destroy the Ottoman state, but it broke the machinery that kept it running. and once that machinery was broken, no amount of reform could fully repair it. Decades before the cold of the 1690s froze the Ottoman heartland, another silent crisis had already carved away at the empire's strength. In the 1560s, under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire seemed at its peak. Its armies had pushed deep into Europe, its fleets controlled the eastern Mediterranean, its treasury overflowed with tribute and taxes, but the foundation of that power, the land itself, was beginning to crack. For several years in the middle of that decade, the rains refused to fall over Anatolia and the Balkans. The drought that settled over these regions was not a single dry season, but a slow, relentless parching that lasted year after year. The rivers that had watered the valleys shrank to muddy streams. The reservoirs and cisterns that farmers had relied on for generations ran dry. The wheat and barley that should have filled the granaries withered in the fields before they could grow tall. The people of the countryside faced a cruel choice. They could eat their seed grain and survive the winter, but that meant no planting in the spring. Or they could save the seed and watch their families go hungry. Across the rolling hills of Anatolia and the fertile plains of the Balkans, villages that had once hummed with life fell silent. Families packed what little they could carry and headed for the towns, hoping for relief. But the towns were struggling too. The grain stores that had been built up over years of good harvests were soon exhausted. The price of bread climbed higher than most could afford. The Ottoman government, still the most powerful administration in the region, tried to respond. It opened its own granaries and distributed grain at controlled prices. It sent orders to provincial governors to do what they could, but the scale of the disaster was too vast for the existing systems to handle. The empire had grown so large that its bureaucracy, once a model of efficiency, was stretched thin. Messages took weeks to travel from Istanbul to the far corners of the realm. The relief that was organized was too little and arrived too late. The health challenges of the era forced communities to rely on local networks of charity, but those networks crumbled as the famine deepened. The toll was not measured only in the loss of life, though that loss was immense. The famine depopulated entire districts. Fields that had been farmed for centuries were abandoned. The tax registers that the Ottoman state used to track its revenues showed entire villages marked as empty. The tax base, the lifeblood of the empire, shrank dramatically. Suleiman the Magnificent had long relied on a steady flow of taxes to fund his military campaigns. He had pushed the empire's borders to their greatest extent, conquering Baghdad, Belgrade, and much of Hungary. His armies had marched into Europe and laid siege to Vienna, but now, in the 1560s, the treasury was running dry. The costs of the campaigns were rising, and the revenues from the countryside were falling. Suleiman was already an old man, and he had spent decades on the battlefield, but the famine forced a painful reckoning. The campaigns into Europe slowed. The great military machine that had seemed unstoppable began to stall. The empire could no longer afford to push deeper into Habsburg territory. The siege of Shijdvar in 1566 would be Suleiman's last campaign. He died in his tent during the siege, an old warrior who had outlived his era. The famine of the 1560s did not end the Ottoman Empire, but it marked a turning point. The expansion that had defined Suleiman's reign came to a halt. The borderlands in Hungary and the Balkans became a static frontier where the Ottomans and Habsburgs would fight a war of attrition for generations. The Golden Age was over. The empire would survive, but it would never again push westward with the same relentless ambition. The fields that had fed its armies were empty, and the tax base that had funded its conquests was gone. The drought of the 1560s had done what no European army could achieve. It had drawn a line in the sand that the Ottoman Empire would never cross. A century earlier and half a world away, another dynasty faced its own unraveling. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had ruled China for less than 100 years when the heavens themselves seemed to turn against it. Beginning in 1333, a cascade of disasters struck the heart of the empire. The Yellow River, which had always been a source of life and danger, overflowed its banks with catastrophic force. The floodwaters spread across the North China Plain, submerging thousands of villages and destroying the winter wheat that was meant to feed millions. But the water did not recede quickly. It lingered, turning fields into swamps and ruining the soil for the next planting. And then, when the waters finally drained away, the rains stopped altogether. A drought settled over the same region, baking the muddy earth into stone. The crops that had survived the flood now withered under a sun that would not relent. And to make matters worse, clouds of locusts descended on the few green patches that remained. The insects ate everything: leaves, stems, and even the bark of young trees. The combination of flood, drought, and locusts was not a single year of hardship. It stretched from 1333 to 1337, a slow, grinding disaster that emptied the countryside. The Mongols had conquered China with speed and ferocity, but they never truly won the trust of the Chinese people. They governed as a foreign elite, excluding the native population from the highest offices and imposing heavy taxes to fund their lavish courts and endless military campaigns. When the famine struck, the Yuan officials did little to ease the suffering. They continued to collect taxes, demanding grain from regions that had none to give. Corrupt local governors hoarded what little food remained, selling it on the black market at prices that only the wealthy could afford. The central government in Beijing was distracted by internal power struggles and could not organize an effective relief effort. The people of the countryside watched their children grow weak and their parents fade. They saw the granaries of the rich stay full while their own bellies remained empty. The anger that had simmered for generations under Mongol rule now found a voice. Secret societies that had kept the flame of Chinese identity alive began to organize. Preachers and prophets wandered from village to village, speaking of a coming upheaval that would sweep the foreigners away. The first sparks of rebellion flared in the early 1350s, but the famine had already laid the kindling. The Red Turban Rebellion, named for the red scarves the rebels wore, erupted across the Yangtze River Valley. It was not a single army but a network of local uprisings, each led by a charismatic figure who promised land, food, and freedom from Mongol oppression. The Yuan government sent troops to crush the rebels, but the soldiers were often just as hungry as the people they were sent to suppress. The rebellion spread faster than the government could contain it. One of the leaders who emerged from this chaos was a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who had lost his entire family to the famine. He had been a beggar and a monk before joining the rebel ranks. He rose through the ranks with a combination of military skill and political cunning. He understood the grievances of the common people because he had lived them. By 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang had defeated his rivals and marched on the Yuan capital of Dodu, modern-day Beijing. The Mongol emperor fled north into the steppes and the Yuan dynasty came to an end. Zhu declared a new dynasty, the Ming, meaning bright or radiant. He took the reign name Hongwu, meaning vastly martial, and set about rebuilding a China that had been shattered by famine, war, and foreign rule. The Great Famine of 1333 to 1337 had been the first crack in the Yuan's foundation. The rebellions it sparked grew into a flood that washed the Mongols away. And from that flood, a new China emerged, one that would last for nearly 3 centuries. The memory of those hungry years did not fade. The Ming emperors built their legitimacy on the promise that they would never let their people starve again. They expanded the Grand Canal, improved grain storage, and reformed the tax system to prevent the same corruption that had doomed the Yuan. The famine had not only destroyed a dynasty, it had taught a lesson that the next one would carry forward, and that lesson was carved into the very ground of Chinese history. Europe faced its own trial by hunger in the 14th century. The Great Famine that had gripped the continent from 1315 to 1317 was not a single isolated disaster. It was the beginning of a long, punishing cycle. After the rains finally stopped and the fields began to recover, Europe did not return to normal. The soil had been exhausted, the seed grain had been eaten. The livestock that should have pulled plows and fertilized fields had been slaughtered for food. The population, already weakened by years of scarcity, had no reserves to fall back on. And so when the weather turned difficult again in the decades that followed, the harvests failed once more. Small famines rippled across different regions. 1321 brought a poor harvest in England. 1325 saw another across France. The early 1340s were brutal across much of the continent, with cold winters and dry summers that kept the grain bins perpetually low. These were not the great, sweeping catastrophes that make their way into history books. They were quieter, more local disasters, a village here, a valley there, a whole province that could not feed itself for a year or two. But their cumulative effect was devastating. Each famine stripped another layer of resilience from the population. People recovered slowly, if at all. The children who survived these lean years grew into adults with weaker bones and more fragile immune systems. The elderly, already frail, passed away in greater numbers. The working population shrank, which meant fewer hands to plant and harvest the next season. The cycle reinforced itself. Trade networks that had once moved grain across Europe began to fray. When a region experienced a bad harvest, it could no longer rely on imports from elsewhere because neighboring regions were often struggling too. Local markets became isolated. Prices fluctuated wildly from one village to the next. The merchants who had made their living moving grain along the rivers and roads saw their profits vanish or their cargo stolen by desperate mobs. The entire system of exchange, which had been the backbone of medieval commerce, grew unstable, and into this weakened, hungry world came the Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in 1346, carried by ships that docked at the Crimean port of Kaffa. From there, it spread with terrifying speed along the same trade routes that had once carried grain. But the plague did not strike a healthy continent. It struck a continent that had been malnourished for decades. The same families that had survived the famines of the 1320s and 1340s were the ones now facing the disease. Their bodies, already depleted by years of poor nutrition, had far less ability to fight off the infection. The death toll was staggering. In some regions, half the population passed away within a few years. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another. But here the scale was so immense that the old structures of village life simply collapsed. The fields that had been fought over for grain were now abandoned entirely. The villages that had survived the famines were emptied by the plague. The feudal system, which had already been strained by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, broke apart under the weight of this second blow. Lords could not find enough peasants to work their lands, which meant they could not collect enough rent to maintain their armies or their castles. Peasants who survived the plague found themselves in high demand. They could demand better terms, lower rents, and more freedom. The old bonds of serfdom, which had tied people to the land for generations, dissolved. The world that emerged from the twin crises of famine and plague was not the same world that had entered them. And it was hunger, the long, grinding hunger of the decades before the Black Death, that had made the catastrophe so complete. Now go back more than 1,000 years before the Black Death, and you find an event so strange that it was written into the chronicles of half the world. In the year 536, the sun began to dim. It did not fade for a day or a week. It stayed dim, casting a pale, cold light over the entire Mediterranean and beyond. The sky took on a strange color, bluish-gray, and the shadows were weak. People in Constantinople, in Rome, in Antioch, looked up and wondered what had happened to the heavens. They did not know that far away, a massive volcanic eruption had thrown ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere. The particles spread around the globe, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet. The year without a summer had begun. The cold did not relent. The following year, 537, brought another eruption. The climate slipped into a deep chill that lasted for years. In the heart of the Byzantine Empire, which stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, the harvests failed. The wheat that had fed the great city of Constantinople did not grow. The olive trees that had sustained the countryside for centuries froze and died. The rivers that had watered the plains of Anatolia and the Levant ran low, and the fields dried up. The people who depended on those fields faced a slow, grinding scarcity. The health challenges of the era forced communities to share what little they had, but the scale of the crisis was immense. The volcanic winter of 536 did not last a single season. It stretched into the early 540s, a long, cold shadow that fell across the dreams of an empire. Justinian I ruled in Constantinople. He was an ambitious emperor who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory. He had already sent his greatest general, Belisarius, to reconquer North Africa and Italy. The campaigns were costly, but they were succeeding. The Byzantine treasury was strained, but the victories seemed worth the price. Then the famine struck. The grain shipments from Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, shrank as the Nile itself ran low. The government tried to distribute grain from its stores, but the stores were soon exhausted. The price of bread in the capital soared. People who had once supported Justinian's grand ambitions now struggled to feed their own children. The emperor faced a brutal choice. He could continue pouring gold into the wars of reconquest, hoping to hold the new territories, or he could pull back and conserve what little remained. He chose to press forward. The conquests in Italy continued, but the cost rose higher with every empty granary. The soldiers who fought for the empire were paid less and fed less. Their morale crumbled. The newly captured provinces, strained by the same climate disaster, could not support themselves, let alone contribute taxes to the imperial treasury. And then, just as the famine began to ease, a far greater disaster arrived. In the year 541, the plague of Justinian struck the city of Constantinople. It was a disease unlike anything the Mediterranean had seen. The health challenges of the era reshaped how communities cared for one another, but the scale of this outbreak overwhelmed every system of support. The plague swept through the empire, killing perhaps a third of the population of the capital alone. It followed the same trade routes that had once carried grain. The fields that had already been emptied by famine were now emptied of the farmers who had struggled to replant them. The army, already weakened by the cold years, lost thousands of soldiers. The dream of a restored Roman Empire crumbled. Justinian lived on, but his empire was transformed. The territories he had reconquered in Italy and North Africa were left too weak to defend. The Lombards and other invaders swept into the vacuum. The Byzantine state, which had once looked outward toward the old Roman world, now turned inward. It became a medieval empire centered on the Greek-speaking heartland of Anatolia and the Balkans. The grand ambitions of the 6th century gave way to the long survival of the medieval era. The volcanic winter of 536 and the famine it caused had not only emptied the treasury and the fields, it had broken the momentum of an empire that had dared to dream of restoring the ancient world. The cold shadow of those years faded from the sky, but its effects lingered in the shape of a smaller, more cautious Byzantium, one that would survive for another 9 centuries, but never again reach for the glory of Rome. England felt the aftershocks of those cold years for generations. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had swept across northern Europe, but its memory lingered longest in the English countryside. The rains had rotted the harvests, the grain had run out, and thousands of families had been driven from their lands. The survivors rebuilt as best they could, planting again when the weather finally steadied. But the land had been wounded. The soil, exhausted by years of poor harvests, never fully recovered its old fertility. and the population, already thinned by hunger, was slow to rebound. Then, in the early 1330s, a new wave of trouble arrived. It was not a single catastrophic season like the Great Famine. It was a series of smaller, localized crop failures that spread across different parts of England. The harvest failed in 1333 in some counties, then again in 1334 in others. A cold spring in 1335 killed the young wheat. A wet summer in 1336 drowned the barley. Each failure was a fresh blow to a system that had never fully healed. The grain bins that had been rebuilt with such effort were emptied again. Prices that had begun to settle climbed back toward famine levels. The poorest families, those who lived hand-to-mouth on the edge of survival, found themselves once more staring into an empty bowl. And it was not just the fields that suffered. The sheep that dotted the English hillsides, the source of the wool that made England wealthy, began to die. A disease spread through the flocks, a murrain that left animals weak and feverish. The wool clip, the annual shearing that paid rents and fed families, shrank dramatically. The merchants who had built fortunes on English wool saw their supply chains crumble. The landowners who depended on sheep to manure their thin soils lost their best fertilizer. The entire agricultural economy, already staggering from the failed harvests, took a second blow. The combination of bad weather, poor harvests, and sick sheep created a slow, grinding crisis. It did not kill millions in a single year the way the Great Famine had, but it hollowed out the countryside over the course of a decade. Tenants who could not pay their rents were evicted. Lords who could not collect their rents fell into debt. The old feudal obligations, the ties that bound peasant to lord, land to labor, grew strained and frayed. People began to move, to drift toward the towns, to seek work wherever they could find it. The labor market, once tightly controlled by custom and law, began to loosen. And then came the Black Death in 1348. The plague struck a population already weakened by years of scarcity. The mortality was catastrophic. But the survivors, those who lived through the twin disasters of hunger and disease, found themselves in a new world. Labor was scarce, workers could demand higher wages. Landlords, desperate to keep their fields cultivated, offered better terms. For the first time in generations, the common people of England had leverage. The aristocracy tried to push back. In 1351, the government passed the Statute of Labourers, which tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force peasants to accept the old conditions. But the law could not undo the demographic reality. The workers knew they were needed, and they refused to accept the old bonds. The resentment simmered for 3 decades. The lords demanded higher rents and stricter controls. The peasants remembered the years of hunger and the unfairness of a system that demanded taxes even when the fields were bare. And then, in 1381, the anger exploded. The English peasants' revolt was not a single, unified uprising. It was a wave of local rebellions that swept across the south and east of England. Peasants marched on London, burned the mansions of hated officials, and demanded an end to serfdom and unfair taxes. The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed, its demands rejected. But the memory of that uprising changed the relationship between the ruling class and the common people. The old feudal order, already cracked by the famines of the 1330s and the plague that followed, never fully recovered. Serfdom faded away in England over the following decades, not by law but by practice. The labor market that emerged from the long crisis was more flexible, more mobile, and more independent than anything that had come before. The famines of the 1330s had not caused the peasants' revolt by themselves, but they had broken the trust that bound the countryside together. When the people rose up, they were not only fighting against taxes, they were fighting against the memory of hunger, of watching their children grow weak while the lords collected their rents. And in that fight, they reshaped the future of English society. Across the sea, another feudal order faced its own test of cold and hunger. In the 1880s, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, a military government that had kept the country stable and isolated for nearly 2 centuries. The land was fertile, the people disciplined, and the system seemed unshakable. But in 1783, a volcanic eruption in Iceland, far to the north, sent a cloud of ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded history, and its effects circled the globe. The ash blocked sunlight, cooling the planet and disrupting weather patterns for years. In Japan, the cold set in with a vengeance. The summer of 1783 was barely warm enough to grow rice. Then 1784 brought an even worse disaster. The rains did not come when they were needed, and when they did arrive, they came as torrential floods that washed away the young plants. The cold lingered into autumn, killing the harvest before it could ripen. Across the main island of Honshu and into the northern regions of Tohoku, the rice paddies that had fed the nation for centuries produced almost nothing. The Tokugawa shogunate, based in Edo, modern Tokyo, had built its authority on the careful management of the rice economy. Rice was not just food, it was the currency of the realm. Samurai were paid in rice stipends, taxes were assessed in rice. The entire social order rested on the assumption that the harvest would come. When it failed, the entire system began to tremble. The famine that followed was known as the Tenmei famine, named after the imperial era in which it occurred. It was not a single year of hardship, but a grinding crisis that stretched from 1783 into 1788. The health challenges of the era forced families to share what little they had, but the scale of the scarcity overwhelmed local charity. In the hardest-hit provinces, villagers ate grass, bark, and even the clay from the hillsides to fill their empty stomachs. Thousands of families abandoned their homes and walked toward the cities, hoping for relief that rarely came. The shogunate tried to respond. It ordered the release of grain from official storehouses and set up soup kitchens in some areas. But the bureaucracy was slow. The local officials who were supposed to distribute the food often hoarded it for themselves or sold it on the black market. Corruption, which had always lurked beneath the surface of the Tokugawa system, now became visible to everyone. The people of the countryside, who had endured years of heavy taxes and rigid controls, began to lose their patience. In 1787, a wave of uprisings swept across the affected provinces. Peasants stormed the granaries of wealthy merchants and local lords. They destroyed tax records and demanded lower levies. The largest of these revolts, the Taikurabe uprising in the feudal domain of Kasama, saw thousands of farmers march on the castle of their daimyo, their lord. The rebellion was suppressed, but the damage to the shogunate's reputation was lasting. The samurai class, the traditional warriors who had once been the backbone of Tokugawa power, also grew restless. Their rice stipends were cut or delayed as the treasury emptied. Many samurai fell into debt. They watched the merchants grow fat on speculation while they themselves struggled to feed their families. The old code of honor and duty began to feel hollow. The cracks in the feudal order widened. The Tenmei famine did not end Tokugawa rule overnight, but it was a turning point. It exposed the weaknesses of a system that could not cope with crisis. The shogunate had governed by controlling the resources of the land. When the land itself failed, the government's authority evaporated. The memory of those hungry years stayed with the generation that lived through them. When the American warships arrived in 1853, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade, the shogunate could not muster the unity or the trust to resist effectively. The old order crumbled, and the Meiji Restoration of 1868 swept it away. The samurai were abolished, the feudal domains dissolved, and a new centralized state emerged. The Tenmei famine had been a warning, a crack in the foundation that no amount of repair could seal. And when the next great crisis arrived, the entire structure came down. 2 generations after the Tenmei famine, Japan faced another trial by hunger. The Tenpo era, which began in 1830, brought a decade of hardship that would test the Tokugawa shogunate to its breaking point. The early 1830s were marked by erratic weather across the Japanese archipelago. Cold springs followed by wet summers killed the rice seedlings in the nurseries. The rains that should have nourished the young plants arrived as torrential floods that washed away the topsoil and left the paddies barren. In the northern provinces of Tohoku, where the climate was already marginal for rice cultivation, the harvests failed completely. The year 1833 was a disaster. The rice crop across much of the country was less than half of normal. The following year brought no relief. The cold lingered, the rains refused to come at the right time, and the grain bins that had held reserves from better years were soon emptied. But the natural disaster was only the beginning of the suffering. The Tokugawa government in Edo had grown comfortable over 2 centuries of peace. The samurai who administered the provinces were often more concerned with maintaining their own wealth than with governing effectively. When the famine struck, the corruption that had been hidden beneath the surface of the system became impossible to ignore. Local officials hoarded the grain that was meant for relief, selling it on the black market at prices that only the wealthy could afford. Tax collectors continued to demand payment in rice, even from villages that had harvested nothing. Peasants who could not pay were forced to sell their land, their tools, and even their children to satisfy the debt. The health challenges of the era forced families to make impossible choices, but here the cruelty of the system compounded the cruelty of the weather. In the province of Matsu, in the far north of Honshu, the suffering was so intense that entire villages were abandoned. The fields that had been farmed for centuries lay fallow. The people who remained were reduced to eating the bark of trees and the roots of wild plants. Reports from the time describe how the roads were lined with those who had set out in search of food and never found it. The famine did not end in a single year. It stretched from 1833 through 1837, a slow, grinding crisis that wore down the resilience of the rural population. Each failed harvest pushed more families into destitution. Each wave of scarcity deepened the anger that simmered beneath the surface of Japanese society. And then the anger boiled over. In 1836, a major uprising exploded in the province of Mikawa, south of modern Nagoya. Thousands of peasants armed with farming tools and wooden spears marched on the castle of their local lord. They destroyed the homes of wealthy merchants who had profited from the famine. They demanded the reduction of taxes and the distribution of grain from the storehouses. The shogunate sent troops to crush the rebellion, and the leaders were executed, but the uprising was only the most visible sign of a much deeper unrest. Across the country, smaller revolts flickered and flared. Villages refused to pay their taxes. Peasants attacked the offices of corrupt officials. The old order, which had rested on the assumption that the people would endure their hardships in silence, was cracking. The Tokugawa government understood that something had to change. In 1841, a series of reforms was announced known as the Tenpo reforms. The shogunate tried to address the most obvious problems. It ordered the cancellation of debts owed by samurai to merchants. It tried to control prices and break up the monopolies that had driven food costs so high. It encouraged frugality and moral discipline, hoping to restore the traditional values that had once held society together. But the reforms were too little and too late. They did nothing to address the fundamental weakness of the feudal system itself. The land was still controlled by a class of lords who answered only to themselves. The tax system was still based on rice, which made it vulnerable to every bad harvest. The corruption that had allowed officials to hoard grain while people starved was never rooted out. The Tenpo reforms were a bandage on a wound that was already infected. The famine of the 1830s had shown the Japanese people that their government could not protect them. When the next great challenge arrived, the arrival of the American fleet under Commodore Perry in 1853, the shogunate could not command the loyalty it needed to resist. The old order crumbled and the Meiji Restoration swept it away. The Tenpo famine had been a slow poison that weakened the Tokugawa system from within. It did not destroy the shogunate by itself, but it cracked the foundation. And when the walls began to shake, the entire structure came down. The same pattern of hunger and collapse played out in the frozen forests of Russia, where the 17th century opened with a disaster that nearly erased the nation itself. A dynastic crisis had already thrown the realm into chaos. The ancient Rurik line had ended with the death of Tsar Fedor I in 1598. His successor, Boris Godunov, faced immediate opposition from rival noble families who questioned his right to rule. The political instability was bad enough, but then the heavens turned against the land. In 1600, the rains refused to fall. The summer was cold and dry, and the harvest that should have filled the granaries was pitiful. The following year brought no relief. A killing frost struck in the middle of summer, blackening the young grain in the fields. The winter that followed was brutal, and when spring came, there was no seed grain left to plant. The peasants, who had already been stripped of their reserves by heavy taxes and years of conflict, faced a choice that no farmer should ever have to make. They could eat the seed and survive the winter, or they could save it and hope for a better year. Many ate the seed. The famine that gripped Russia from 1600 to 1602 was not a localized shortage but a national catastrophe. The health challenges of the era forced families to share what little they had, but the scale of the scarcity overwhelmed every local bond of charity. In the countryside, entire villages were abandoned. The roads leading to Moscow filled with refugees who had nowhere else to go. They arrived in the capital weak and desperate, only to find that the city itself was running out of food. The price of rye, the staple grain that sustained the Russian people, soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. The government of Tsar Boris Godunov tried to respond. He opened the royal granaries and distributed grain to the poor. He ordered price controls and tried to prevent hoarding, but the bureaucracy was weak, and the corruption that had plagued the Russian state for generations made enforcement impossible. Local officials and wealthy merchants seized the opportunity to profit from the suffering. They bought up grain at low prices and sold it back at enormous markups. The relief efforts failed, the famine deepened, and with it the political crisis spiraled out of control. The nobles who had never accepted Boris Godunov as their rightful ruler used the famine as proof that the Tsar had lost the favor of heaven. In the eyes of the Russian people, a ruler who could not feed them was a ruler who had been abandoned by God. The whispers spread from village to village. The Tsar was cursed, the dynasty was illegitimate, the time had come for a change. In 1603, a false claimant appeared on the borderlands. He claimed to be the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, a prince who had supposedly survived an assassination attempt years earlier. The pretender, known as the false Dmitri, gathered support from the Cossacks, from disgruntled nobles, and from the Polish king who saw an opportunity to expand his influence. The famine had weakened the Russian state so thoroughly that it could not muster the resources to stop him. In 1605, Boris Godunov died suddenly, and the false Dmitri marched on Moscow. The capital fell without a serious fight. The pretender was crowned Tsar, but his rule was brief and chaotic. He was assassinated within a year, and the country plunged into the full chaos of the time of troubles. For the next several years, Russia was a battleground. Armies loyal to competing factions fought across the countryside. The Polish king sent troops to claim the throne for his own son. Swedish forces invaded from the north. The country that had once been a unified kingdom fragmented into regions controlled by warlords, foreign soldiers, and roving bands of Cossacks. The famine had not only emptied the fields, it had emptied the state of its authority. The people who had survived those terrible years carried the memory of a government that had failed to protect them. They had seen the Tsar hoard grain while the peasants starved. They had watched the nobles scheme for power while their children grew weak. the old loyalty to the Ruric dynasty, which had bound the nation together for centuries, was shattered. And yet from that destruction, something new emerged. In 1612, a national militia was formed in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. It was led by a merchant named Kuzma Minin and a prince named Dmitry Pozharsky. These were not men of royal blood. They were commoners and soldiers who had seen their country torn apart and decided to fight back. The militia marched on Moscow, drove out the Polish garrison, and liberated the capital. The victory was not just a military one. It was a declaration that the Russian people would no longer be ruled by foreigners or by corrupt nobles who had failed them. A national assembly was called to choose a new Tsar. After weeks of debate, the assembly elected Michael Romanov, a 16-year-old boy who was related to the old dynasty. He was young, inexperienced, and weak, but he was a compromise that all factions could accept. In 1613, Michael Romanov was crowned Tsar, and the dynasty he founded would rule Russia for more than 300 years. The Romanovs did not forget the lessons of the time of troubles. They built a stronger, centralized state, one that could control the nobility, collect taxes efficiently, and maintain an army loyal to the throne. They expanded the borders of Russia, pushing eastward into Siberia and westward toward the Baltic. The famine of 1600 to 1602 had been the crisis that broke the old order, but it also cleared the ground for a new one. The Romanov dynasty rose from the ashes of that disaster, and it would carry the memory of hunger as a warning that no ruler could afford to ignore. A river that had nourished civilizations for millennia turned against its people. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, failed to rise as it should have in the late 1850s. Year after year, the floodwaters that traditionally spread across the floodplains and deposited fertile silt came lower than expected. The fields that had produced abundant wheat and corn for centuries dried out under a relentless sun. The drought stretched into 1860 and the harvest shrank dramatically. But this was not merely a natural disaster. The ruler of Egypt at the time, Khedive Ismail Pasha, had grand ambitions. He dreamed of modernizing his country, building railways, factories, and a magnificent new capital in Cairo. To fund these projects, he had borrowed heavily from European banks, and to pay back those loans, he needed cash crops, especially cotton. The American Civil War, which erupted in 1861, created an immense opportunity. The conflict cut off the supply of cotton from the southern United States to the textile mills of Britain and France. Suddenly, the world needed cotton from anywhere it could get it. Khedive Ismail saw his chance. He ordered Egyptian farmers to plant cotton on every available acre of land, even on fields that had traditionally grown food. The price of cotton soared, and for a few years, Egypt became incredibly wealthy. But the policy came with a hidden cost. When the drought struck, the farmers who had been forced to switch to cotton had no food reserves. The grain fields that should have fed the population had been converted to cotton fields. The government, obsessed with maximizing cotton revenue, did nothing to reverse the trend. Food production collapsed. The health challenges of the era forced communities to share what little they had, but the scale of the scarcity overwhelmed local charity. Across the Egyptian countryside, families who had once grown their own wheat now had to buy bread at prices that had skyrocketed. Those who could not afford it went hungry. The famine that gripped Egypt in 1860 and 1861 did not kill on the same scale as some of the earlier disasters in this story, but it was devastating in its consequences. It emptied villages and weakened the rural population, and it revealed a fatal flaw in Ismail Pasha's strategy. The cotton boom that had seemed like a miracle was actually a trap. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, the cotton market crashed. The price of Egyptian cotton plummeted. The loans that Ismail had taken out to finance his modernization projects now came due, but the revenue that was supposed to pay them back had evaporated. Egypt was bankrupt. The European powers, Britain and France, who had lent the money, saw their opportunity. They demanded control over Egypt's finances to ensure repayment. Ismail resisted, but he was removed from power by the Ottoman Sultan in 1879 under pressure from the Europeans. His successor, Tewfik Pasha, was weaker and more compliant. The European control tightened. A nationalist uprising against this foreign interference erupted in 1881, led by Colonel Ahmed Yorabi. The British, fearing for the security of the Suez Canal, which was the vital link to their empire in India, intervened militarily. In 1882, British warships bombarded Alexandria and British troops landed in Egypt. They crushed the Yorabi revolt and established a de facto protectorate over the country. Egypt remained under British occupation for the next 70 years. The famine of 1860 to 1861 had not caused the British occupation by itself, but it had broken the back of Ismail's regime. It had exposed the fragility of an economy built on a single cash crop and on foreign debt. Once the fields lay empty and the treasury was drained, the door was open for the European powers to walk in. The warning that had gone unheeded in the 1860s became a reality in the 1880s. Egypt lost its independence not to an invading army, but to the consequences of a drought and a cotton boom that had blinded its rulers to the needs of its people. The same decade that saw Egypt slip into European hands also witnessed a different kind of unraveling in the high plateaus of Iran. The Qajar dynasty had ruled Persia for nearly a century by 1870, but its grip on power was already loose, weakened by corruption, military defeats, and a treasury that never seemed to fill. Then the rain stopped. The drought that settled over the Persian heartland in 1870 was not a brief dry spell. It lingered, turning the wheat fields of the northwest into dust and cracking the soil of the central plains. The harvest that should have sustained the population for the coming year withered before it could be gathered, and the following year brought no relief. The sun continued to beat down, and the rivers that had watered the ancient irrigation systems shrank to a trickle. The reservoirs that had held water for centuries went dry. The great cities of Tabriz, Isfahan, and Tehran saw their markets empty of grain. The price of bread, the staff of life for every Persian family, climbed higher than anyone could remember. The Qajar court, led by Nasir al-Din Shah, was not known for its efficiency. The Shah himself was more interested in luxury and foreign travel than in the day-to-day administration of his realm. The officials who managed the provinces were often appointed not for their competence but for their willingness to pay bribes to the central government. When the famine struck, this system proved powerless. The state had no reserves of grain. It had no effective system for distributing relief. The few storehouses that existed were soon emptied, and the officials who controlled them often sold the grain on the black market instead of giving it to the starving. The health challenges of the era forced families to share what little they had, but the scale of the scarcity was beyond anything local charity could handle. Across the countryside, villages were abandoned as people fled toward the cities in search of food, only to find the same hunger waiting there. The death toll from the famine of 1870 to 1871 is difficult to determine with precision, but historians estimate that at least 1.5 million people passed away, perhaps as many as 2 million. That represented a staggering portion of the population, perhaps a tenth or more of the entire country. The land that had once supported thriving communities was left hollow. The fields that had been farmed for generations lay fallow. The economic damage was immense, but the political damage was even deeper. The Persian people had long endured the corruption and indifference of their rulers, but the famine pushed their patience past its breaking point. In the years that followed, a new kind of opposition began to organize. Merchants, intellectuals, and religious leaders started to demand reform. They wanted a constitution that would limit the power of the Shah and create a representative assembly that could hold the government accountable. They wanted laws that would prevent the kind of mismanagement that had turned a drought into a catastrophe. The protests grew slowly at first, but they did not fade. They gathered strength with each new injustice. By 1905, the movement had become a full-blown revolution. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 forced the Qajar Shah to accept the creation of a parliament, the Majlis, and to sign a constitution that limited his authority. It was a landmark achievement, the first time in Persian history that the absolute power of the monarchy had been checked by law. But the revolution did not end the Qajar dynasty's decline. The Shahs fought back, often with Russian support, and the parliament was dissolved and reinstated several times. The famine of 1870 had not directly caused the revolution, but it had been the first crack in the wall of royal legitimacy. It had shown the people that their rulers could not protect them, and once that trust was broken, it could never be fully restored. The Qajar dynasty would stagger on for another 2 decades, but its power was hollow. In 1925, the last Qajar Shah was deposed, and a new dynasty, the Pahlavis, took the throne. The centuries-old monarchy had been replaced, not by a foreign army, but by the slow accumulation of grievances that had begun in the dusty fields of a forgotten famine. The Mughal emperor in Delhi still wore the title of ruler over Bengal in 1769, but his authority had become a hollow echo. The vast province that had once sent enormous wealth to the imperial treasury was now governed by a Nawab who answered not to Delhi but to the British East India Company. The company had already defeated the local ruler at the Battle of Plassey 12 years earlier, and it controlled the real power, the right to collect taxes, the command of the army, and the flow of trade. The Mughal court could do nothing but watch. Then the rains failed. The drought that settled over Bengal in 1769 was not a sudden calamity but a slow, creeping disaster. The rice paddies that had fed millions for centuries turned dry and cracked. The great rivers that had carried boats and fish shrank to shallow streams. The harvest that should have filled the granaries produced almost nothing, and yet the British company continued to demand its tax payments, and it continued to export grain from Bengal to other parts of India and to Europe. The company's officials saw the famine as an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. They did not open their storehouses, they did not halt the exports, they did not reduce the tax burden on the farmers who had lost everything. The Mughal administration, already reduced to a shadow, had no power to intervene. The emperor in Delhi could not send relief, could not order the company to change its policies, could not even protect the farmers who were still nominally his subjects. The famine completed what Plassey had begun. It stripped away the last pretense of Mughal authority over Bengal. The people of the province understood that the old empire was gone. The tax collectors who came to their villages worked for the company. The merchants who controlled the grain trade worked for the company. The soldiers who kept order took orders from Calcutta, not Delhi. When the famine finally ended in 1773, after millions of lives had been lost, Bengal belonged to the British completely. The once great Mughal province had become the cornerstone of a new empire, one that would soon extend its reach across the entire subcontinent. The famine of 1769 did not create the British Empire in India by itself, but it burned away the last fragments of Mughal control, and from those ashes a new imperial power rose. The wheel of fortune turned against the oldest monarchy in Africa in the early 1970s. The Ethiopian Empire under Emperor Haile Selassie had survived war, invasion, and decades of isolation. It had weathered the Italian occupation and emerged as a symbol of African independence, but no symbol could withstand what the heavens sent next. Beginning in 1972, the rains that watered the highlands of northern Ethiopia failed, not for a season but for years. The parched soil of Wollo and Tigray could not support the crops that millions depended on. The drought crept southward and the harvest shrank to nothing. The emperor's government, centered in the capital of Addis Ababa, was distant from these rural provinces. It was a feudal system where local lords controlled the land, and the emperor's officials collected taxes but rarely visited the villages. When reports of the famine reached the capital, they were met with disbelief, then with silence. The government did not want to admit that its people were hungry. It feared that acknowledging the crisis would weaken the emperor's authority and discourage foreign investment. So the reports were suppressed, the aid requests delayed, and the grain stores kept locked. Geopolitics made the situation worse. The Cold War had turned Ethiopia into a strategic prize. The United States supported Haile Selassie as a reliable ally in the Horn of Africa, and American aid flowed to the government in Addis Ababa. But that aid was directed toward military and development projects, not toward a famine that the government refused to acknowledge. When foreign journalists finally reached the affected regions in 1973, the images they captured shocked the world. The health challenges of the era forced families to share what little they had, but the scale of the scarcity had overwhelmed every local system of support. The footage showed a landscape of empty fields and silent villages. The international community responded with offers of food and money, but the Ethiopian government's slow and reluctant cooperation meant that much of the aid arrived too late or never reached the hungry. The famine stretched into 1974 and the death toll climbed. The emperor's failure became impossible to ignore. Protests erupted among students, workers, and soldiers who had seen the images and heard the stories. They demanded accountability, food, and reform. The army, once the loyal backbone of the monarchy, began to split. Junior officers formed a committee known as the Derg. They arrested the emperor's ministers, then the emperor himself. In September of 1974, Haile Selassie, who had ruled for over 4 decades, was deposed. He died in captivity soon after, and the ancient Solomonic dynasty, which traced its lineage back to the Queen of Sheba, came to an end. The Derg took full control and declared Ethiopia a socialist state. They aligned with the Soviet Union and pursued a brutal program of land reform and collectivization. The famine had not only destroyed the harvests, it had destroyed an empire. The monarchy that had stood for centuries fell because a drought met a government that refused to see, and in its place rose a regime that would rule through fear, plunging the country into decades of conflict and another famine even more devastating than the first. The warning of 1972 had been ignored, and the price was paid by millions. A decade later, a second famine struck an even harder blow. The Derg, the military committee that had seized power after Haile Selassie's fall, promised to build a new Ethiopia. They spoke of land reform, equality, and an end to feudal oppression. But their rule quickly turned into a brutal dictatorship. They crushed dissent with violence, forced millions into resettlement camps, and waged a relentless war against separatist movements in Tigray and Eritrea. The countryside, already fragile from years of conflict and mismanagement, was pushed to the edge. Then the rains failed again. Beginning in 1983, the drought that had haunted Ethiopia returned with a vengeance. The highlands of the north, the provinces of Tigray, Wollo, and Eritrea, baked under a sun that refused to relent. The crops that had been planted with desperate hope withered into dust. The rivers that had watered the valleys shrank to muddy trickles, and the government, which controlled the distribution of food, did not respond with compassion. The Derg was fighting a war, and the war came first. Grain that should have fed the hungry was diverted to the army. Food aid from abroad was blocked from reaching rebel-held areas because the government saw hunger as a weapon. Villages that had once been self-sufficient now became landscapes of scarcity. People walked for days, carrying what little they could, toward relief camps that were overcrowded and undersupplied. The health challenges of the era forced families to make choices no one should have to face, and the silence of the regime deepened the suffering. The world did not know at first. The Derg controlled the information that left the country, and they insisted that the situation was under control. But in October of 1984, a British news crew managed to reach the camp at Koram in northern Ethiopia. The images they broadcast showed the scale of the crisis in stark, unforgettable detail. The cameras captured the long lines of silent families, the makeshift shelters, the quiet endurance of people who had nothing left. The footage spread across the globe with shocking speed. It sparked an outpouring of international sympathy unlike anything seen before. Musicians and activists organized massive charity concerts, including the global event Live Aid in July of 1985. Money poured in from ordinary people in every corner of the world. Governments sent shiploads of grain and medical supplies. The international relief effort was one of the largest in history, driven by the simple, urgent desire to help. But the aid did not always reach those who needed it most. The Derg government controlled the ports and the roads. They funneled the grain to areas they controlled, often to soldiers and loyalists, while starving the rebel regions. They also used the aid to continue their war, selling some of the food for weapons. The famine stretched into 1985 and beyond, and the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million. The world saw the suffering, but the world could not stop the politics that made it worse. The famine did more than empty the camps. It exposed the nature of the Derg regime. The images of hungry children and desperate families were broadcast alongside reports of government corruption and military brutality. International donors grew frustrated. The Ethiopian people, who had already endured years of terror, began to lose any remaining faith in the rulers who had promised to save them. The rebel movements, especially the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, gained strength. They argued that the regime in Addis Ababa could never protect the people, and the famine proved them right. By the late 1980s, the Derg was losing control. The army was exhausted, the treasury empty, the people alienated. In 1991, the rebels marched on Addis Ababa and the regime collapsed. The Derg's leader, Mengistu Haile Mariam, fled to Zimbabwe. A new transitional government took power, and one of its first actions was to acknowledge the right of Eritrea to self-determination. After decades of war and suffering, Eritrea became an independent nation in 1993. The famine of 1983 to 1985 had not caused that independence by itself, but it had stripped away the last legitimacy of a regime that had ruled through fear. The empty fields and the silent camps became a memory that would not fade, and from that memory, a new map of the Horn of Africa was drawn. The cold of that final winter of the war fell over a country already stripped of its resources. The Netherlands had been under Nazi occupation since 1940, and by the autumn of 1944, the noose was tightening. The Allied forces had liberated the southern provinces, but the northern and western parts of the country, including the major cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, remained firmly in German hands. As the Allied advance stalled at the Rhine, the German authorities decided to make the Dutch pay for their hopes of liberation. In September of 1944, they imposed a total embargo on food shipments into the occupied zone. Trains stopped running. Barges that had carried grain and potatoes along the canals were halted. The flow of food that had sustained the cities through 4 years of occupation was cut off completely. The timing could not have been worse. The harvest of 1944 had been poor, damaged by the fighting and by the deliberate flooding of farmland that the Germans had ordered to slow the Allied advance. The reserves that usually carried the population through the winter were already low. When the blockade began, the cities had perhaps a few weeks of food left and then nothing. By November, the rations in the western cities had fallen below subsistence level. The official daily allowance dropped to just a few hundred calories per person, a fraction of what an adult needs to survive. But even those meager rations were not always available. The distribution system, already weakened by years of occupation, began to break down. People stood in line for hours only to find the shops empty. The health challenges of the era forced families to rely on whatever they could find. Tulip bulbs, which had once been a symbol of Dutch wealth, were boiled and eaten. Sugar beets were grated into a thin, watery porridge. People stripped the bark from trees and ground it into a flour that could be mixed with whatever else was available. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in decades. The canals froze solid and the cities were locked in ice. There was no coal for heating, no oil for lamps. Families burned furniture and books to stay warm. The combination of extreme cold and almost no food created a slow, grinding crisis that wore down the population over the course of months. The death toll rose steadily. The elderly were the first to go, then the very young. Hospitals filled with people suffering from the illnesses that follow severe scarcity. The German authorities, who had imposed the blockade, watched from their heated offices and did nothing. They had a strategic goal. They wanted to pressure the Dutch resistance, which had grown more active as the war turned against Germany. They wanted to discourage the population from supporting the Allied advance, but the famine did not break the spirit of the Dutch people. The resistance continued its work. Sabotage operations against German supply lines, the hiding of Allied airmen, the production of underground newspapers, all of it went on. The hunger was real and terrible, but it did not produce surrender. Then in April of 1945, as the final Allied offensives pushed into Germany, the Nazi regime began to crack. The new leader of the Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who had overseen the blockade, realized that the game was over. He agreed to allow Allied airdrops of food into the starving cities. The humanitarian operation, known as Operation Manna, began on April 29. British and American bombers, the same aircraft that had rained destruction on German cities, now flew low over the Dutch countryside, dropping bags of flour, canned meat, and chocolate. The sight of the planes, painted white and flying without escort, brought tears to the eyes of those who watched from below. The famine did not end overnight, but the arrival of the food marked the beginning of the end. On May 5, 1945, the German forces in the Netherlands surrendered. The occupation, which had lasted 5 brutal years, was over. The Dutch people emerged from the winter into a spring of liberation, but they carried the scars of the hunger winter with them. More than 20,000 people had passed away during those months of scarcity. The survivors were physically weakened, and the psychological impact would last for generations. The famine experience did not topple an empire the way some of the earlier disasters in this story had done. The Nazi Empire was already collapsing under the weight of its own military defeats. But the hunger winter had a profound effect on the future of the Netherlands itself. The old social order, where the wealthy could buy their way out of hardship while the poor suffered, was discredited. The war had shown that collective survival required solidarity. When the political parties began to rebuild after the liberation, they did so with a new consensus. The state would play a more active role in protecting its people. The years after the war saw the creation of a comprehensive social security system, universal health care, and generous unemployment benefits. The Dutch welfare state, one of the most generous in the world, was born in part from the memory of that cold, hungry winter. The famine also deepened the Dutch commitment to international cooperation. The Netherlands had been a neutral country before the war, believing that it could stay out of the conflicts that consumed its neighbors. The occupation had proven that neutrality was no protection. After the war, the Dutch became strong supporters of international organizations, joining NATO and becoming one of the founding members of the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to the European Union. They understood that their security and prosperity depended on being part of a larger community. The hunger winter did not create these changes by itself. The entire experience of the war, the occupation, the resistance, and the liberation shaped the post-war Netherlands, but the famine was the sharpest blade of that experience. It taught the Dutch people what happens when a society is stripped of its resources and abandoned by the international order, and they resolved that it would never happen again. The end of the Nazi occupation restored Dutch sovereignty, but it also transformed the nation. The people who emerged from that winter were not the same people who had entered it. They were more determined, more united, and more committed to building a society where hunger could never again be used as a weapon. Again and again, across centuries and continents, hunger has rewritten the map of power. The 30 famines we have traveled through together are not random tragedies. They form a pattern, a recurring mechanism of historical change that has toppled rulers, sparked revolutions, and redrawn borders. From the Bronze Age collapse to the Dutch hunger winter, from the fall of the Mughals to the end of Haile Selassie's empire, each crisis tested the strength of the systems that claimed to govern. Some empires bent and survived, like Russia after the new economic policy. Others shattered completely, like the Yuan dynasty after its Great Famine. The common thread is unmistakable. When food becomes scarce, the social contract unravels. People lose faith in their leaders, rebellions ignite, foreign powers see their openings. And the old order, no matter how grand, crumbles into dust. The central lesson for any ruler, ancient or modern, is that food security is not a luxury. It is the foundation of stability. An empire that cannot feed its people has already lost the war for their loyalty. The fields and the granaries are more powerful than any army, more enduring than any throne. In our own time, climate change, supply chain disruptions, and political instability still threaten the global food system. The same forces that brought down the Hittites and the Qing dynasty are still at work, only now they move across a world more interconnected than ever. The choice is the same as it has always been. Either build resilient systems that protect the vulnerable, or watch as hunger reshapes the future once again. We hope this journey through history has given you a new perspective on the quiet power of a full harvest and the terrible weight of an empty bowl. If one of these stories surprised you or changed how you see the world, we would love to hear about it in the comments. Which famine struck you as the most unexpected, the most avoidable, or the most defining? Let us know below, and if you want us to explore more hidden forces that shaped empires, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next video. The past is full of warnings. The only question is whether we are willing to listen.